Okay, let's go on to talk about chapter 8 on supporting your ideas. So theoretically, you're going to have a specific purpose to inform my audience about. You're going to have a central idea, that one sentence summary of your speech. You're going to have identified your main points, your 3 main points that you're going to be using. Remember the baskets? And now you're going to be, oh, maybe I didn't mention the baskets yet, but either way, I'll get there. So now you have your main points. Now you've got to have content to put in to your main points to support the points you are making. So this chapter provides 3 different methods or tools of resources that you can put in your main points. And understand, when you use them, they all have to support or connect with the main points of your presentation. So let me go through these 3 different methods. The first one they talk about are examples. Sometimes they're called illustrations or word pictures or stories, but these are stories or examples that you use to support or connect with or to build up your main points. And they give us 3 different methods of telling, 3 different types of examples. The first one is what they call a brief example. This is where you are not extrapolating out, you're not telling a whole story, but if you're talking, for example, about Ford cars made by Ford, you might say, for example, Ford produces many types of cars, including, I think they're done with these now, Expeditions, Ford Fusions, and Ford Escapes as examples of cars that Ford produces. That's it. You're just telling us a brief example, telling us a type, a picture that we can, picture in our mind of what kinds of cars Ford produces. You're not going into any detail about them. You're not talking about them a lot. You are just simply mentioning them to give examples of what kinds of cars Ford produces. My wife was reading an article the other day that Ford is reducing their line of cars they're producing, and we just got a Ford Fusion and no more of those. We've had an Expedition for years and no more of those. I was always looking forward to getting a Ford Excursion, but those went offline several years ago. Okay, then the second type is, actually I just kind of gave you the first 2 types together. One is to say, so Ford has been known for many famous fast cars. For example, the Ford Mustang XYZ or whatever, period. One example. And the other type they said, a brief example, is the giving multiple kinds of examples. So we've kind of talked about that. Okay, then the second one is what they call extended examples. This is where you are telling more full stories. And this is what I love to do in my speaking, is be able to come up with a great story to share with the audience, because I think telling a story is where audiences love to hear stories that are well told. They don't just love to hear stories, but stories that are well told and that have some kind of significant point. I would often use humor in the stories, put a little twist in them, but they like this. And it's telling the story with details, word pictures tell the whole story. We have a couple of stories that we share in terms of somebody who walked into our house. I guess they were drunk or was asleep on our couch. If I had more time, I would tell you that whole story. It involved the police, it involved tasering, and it involved me I had gone to work early in the morning and not responding to my wife's call to come home because somebody was in the house, and I kept telling her, nobody's in the house, it's just one of the friends of our kids and all that. But anyway, great story, and a story upon the story in that. We have stories of my son being rescued by our dog Kona. That whole story, some great stories. But anyway, what stories are you going to come up with? So here's some things they say, suggestions on using the stories. Make sure, number one, make sure the story is pertinent to the topic. If I was doing a speech on Huskies, that story about Kona saving my son's life, great story. If I was doing a speech on home safety, that story about the guy walking into our house, great story. Sometimes here's what happens though, especially if you're speaking frequently. You have an experience or read something or see something or know something now, and you are now just, it's burning a hole in your brain because you want to tell that story somewhere. And so you decide whatever your next speaking engagement is, you are going to take a big hammer and you're going to beat that story into that speech, even if it doesn't fit. Don't do that. Make sure that your story, your example, your illustration is pertinent to your topic. It's a great fit when it works, but don't make it fit. Don't try to make it fit if it doesn't work for you. Okay, second, don't allow your story to overwhelm the entire speech. Sometimes a story can be so touching or so emotional or so emotionally overwhelming that nobody's going to remember anything else you say. All they're going to do is remember that story. So I'm not saying don't use it, but boy, if you don't want them to walk out and say, oh, I remember that story you told about the dog saving your son's life. Well, yeah, but it was about huskies. I don't know anything about that. All they're going to maybe do is remember that story. So, use with care. Use personal stories, great, but use them with care and awareness that may be all they remember from your speech. Is that what you want to happen? Probably not. So just approach them with caution. And then third, consider the length of the example or the story. You don't want it to go on too long, so you may have to edit content. You may have to leave out some details. I'm not good at leaving content out of speeches, so I tend to go on too long with those. But make sure that it's the right size for the story. Don't let that just one long story pretty much be your whole speech. You may need to reduce it way down to make it fit the third main point of your speech. Okay, so then the author gives several examples in there. So anyway, examples are great to use. I love using great examples. I constantly still watch the news and grab stories and articles and all that. Grab them when I can because I never know when I might be able to use that material. Okay, second is statistics. I'm not a great statistics guy, but statistics are wonderful in that they give good, solid, foundational proof and evidence and form to your speech. They are numerical data put in usable form in your presentation. And so here are some suggestions. Number one, make sure you understand what your statistic is saying. You might find an article that you're using that includes a statistic and you're not quite sure what it means, but you include it anyway. Somebody sitting in your audience may know exactly what that statistic is about, and they're going, well, that's not correct. That's not the right use of that statistic, and you're going to feel kind of silly. So make sure you know what that statistic is saying. If you're not sure or not clear, get some help or leave it out. Number two, make sure that statistic is representative. Now, sometimes you'll hear a statistic that just sounds weird or odd, and it certainly grabs your attention, but it's a unique circumstance or a unique situation. It's not universal or representative. And by representative, I mean it would be a normal thing. For example, if you're doing a population count in the state of California year after year after year, and then you have the year 2025 where there is a 8% drop in the population of California, that's significant because it says that over time a population has stayed pretty stable, but then one year we had a big drop of, well, what caused that? And what did that statistic represent? So while it was unique, it was based on a period of normalcy, and then something blipped on the screen. So what is that telling us? And then third, make sure you use the statistic correctly. Now, for example, I'm not going to go through them. You can look it up. But the difference in statistics between the mean, the median, and the mode. Some are that they measure the average number, the number right in the middle, and which one did I not mention? The third one, average, I'm looking at my notes here, most common measurement, and the number that occurs in the middle. Make sure when you're using them correctly, and that your audience, because again, there will be that person out there who knows exactly what you're talking about, and they're going to know whether you presented it correctly or not. Okay, so some suggestions or observations. Statistics make your points measurable. Sometimes on an abstract concept, we want to give it something concrete and specific and measurable, and statistics might be able to do that for you. Number two, don't overuse statistics. Don't use them too much because it could be boring and turning off part of your audience. Use them sparingly. Number three, as with any reference, make sure you tell us where you got the information, maybe the person who did the study, and where they published their study, and so on, the date of the study, etc. And number four, don't assume that people know what you're talking about when you give a statistic. Do you need to explain it and clarify so people can follow along? Don't just put the slide up there because they still may not know what you're talking about. Number five, round off numbers. The number for pi that I know is 3.14159. I'm using this as an example. People don't care about 3.14159 or how much further you can go. 3.14 may be close enough depending on what you're trying to say, but round off the numbers. The distance to the sun within 1/10 of a mile is irrelevant. Within 1,000 miles, within 10,000 miles may be irrelevant. So just give us the ballpark, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, how much information do you need to tell us in your statistics? Give us, so we get the idea, but we don't need to be exactly precise. And then number six, show us. This is where PowerPoints are great because you can create a slide that shows us the bar graph or the pie graph, and don't just tell us that 48% of the population does X and 33% does Y and only 2% does Z. Show us in a pie graph so we can picture what 38% compared to 3% looks like. You get that? Okay. Third type of material to use are testimonies. Testimonies are not stories. They're not stories, but they are people telling us their perspective, their knowledge, their experience. And there are two types of these testimonies that we use. One is expert testimony. The other is peer testimony. Expert testimony, as it says in the name, is from an expert, somebody who is knowledgeable, experienced, well-studied. They are known by others as to be experts in the field. Peer testimony is your neighbor,
Hey Jenna, can you come move your laundry for me?
your coworker, your best friend who had an experience. They're not an expert. They are not necessarily academically knowledgeable in that field. They just had an experience that they are now sharing that experience. They were in the bank when it was robbed. They were in the grocery store when somebody slipped and hit their head. They are bringing that testimony of what they heard, what they saw, what they experienced, but not necessarily what they knew beforehand or that they've done that job for 25 years. Now you can see that each type has its own strengths. The expert testimony brings credibility, that you can trust them because they know, they've studied, they've researched, they've done it for a long time. They're experts. The peer testimony brings a more personable element to it of somebody who was there when something happened. So the only important element here is make sure you use the right kind of testimony for what you're trying to accomplish in your presentation at that time. Okay, then we're going to move on here to talk about how do we share that testimony with the audience. And I've kind of touched on this probably too many times already, but this comes down to, for example, do you use a quote or a paraphrase to tell about this experience? The simple guideline in the textbook is if it is short, 1 or 2 sentences, use a quote. Yeah, I was standing right there by the coffee pot when the person came in with a gun in the bank. Okay. If it's longer than a couple of sentences, then give it a paraphrase. Summarize it and tell us about that. Then when you're doing that, hang on just a second here. Oh, okay. So when you're doing that, make sure you give us those 4 pieces of information: who said it, where they said it, when they said it, and what they said. Give us as many of those 4 as you get. You can't always get all 4 of them. You can usually get at least 2, if not 3, almost every time. But the more you give us, the more confidence your congregation, your audience will have in the power of that testimony. Okay, so suggestions. Number 1, be accurate. If you're using a quote, make sure you have the quote down exactly correct. Now, I came up with this thought of, when you do a quote, why not make it even more powerful to your audience by you say, so according to John Smith, he says, and then you pull out a card that has the quote written on it word for word, and you make sure that they see you are reading from that card, which implies he wants to make sure he's got his information correct, so he's reading it from a card. I wouldn't bother memorizing it, just read it, the quote, word for word. Don't do that if it's a paraphrase, just if it's a brief quote. Second, use qualified sources. Use the experts. Now, it doesn't mean you don't use your neighbor. They are qualified in the sense of they saw exactly what happened. But make sure it's qualified and that you can back up what you say for that qualification. The textbook mentions the idea of celebrities speaking about products, endorsements. Some of them are not experts. They are simply there because people recognize their name, and if they, for example, if they like King James in basketball, then a product he endorses, they may buy that product because King James likes it, not because it's any good or has any he has any credibility in that field. It's just name recognition. Don't do that in your speeches. Go for the person who has the knowledge and or the experience on that topic. Third thing they say is, tell us a little bit about the person who is giving the testimony. Their name, where they're back from, and what their connection is with that topic. Again, that would mean celebrity endorsements out, but use people who've been there, done that, know about that item. Okay, we've talked already about the who said it, where they said it, when they said it, and what they said. And when you're writing your outline, and let me say this about the outline, the preparation outline, remember that the preparation outline reflects a verbal public presentation. So therefore, everything you write in your outline, preparation outline, should reflect the fact that this is a verbal presentation, the outline represents a verbal presentation. So write it as you would say it. Nothing with bullet points, no incomplete sentences, everything complete just as you would say it. Do not include information at the end of the sentence in parentheses that says Smith, 2008, parentheses, period. That's another format. That's not how we do it here. Everything is included in the sentence. According to John Smith in his 2018 book, Why I Want to Go to the Moon, he says, quote, unquote. See, all that can be included in a typical, normal sentence. And look at the outline examples we provide you to see how that can be done. Okay, so I think that's everything I want to include in this chapter. So please, obviously, you're reading the chapters and allowing the videos to supplement the chapter material. So just don't do just one or the other. Please do both. And to hear me say that, you would have had to have watched this video, so I hope you are doing so. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you.